Chapter 1: The King's Decree. The kingdom of Aurelia stretched from the frost-bitten cliffs of the northern range to the warm, wine-rich valleys of the south. It was a land of old magic and older secrets, ruled for 3 centuries by the Lion Throne, a dynasty known as much for its golden-haired kings as for its ruthless grasp on power. The capital, Edivane, lay nestled in the crook of 3 rivers, its spires and bridges rising like a dream of stone and silver. The first snow of winter fell gently over the capital as the royal messenger arrived at House of Kerrigan. Lady Aurelia stood at the far end of the great hall, half hidden behind a pillar, her hands numb from more than the cold. She wasn't meant to be seen after all. Not during official business. Illegitimate daughters were like shadows in noble houses, only visible when needed, and even then only for convenience or cruelty. Her father, the Marquis of Kerrigan, was smiling as he opened the scroll, the king's wax seal broken by impatient fingers. The letter gleamed with gold-threaded ink, stamped with the lion crest of the royal family. The Marquis' eyes moved swiftly, and Aurelia saw the way his lips curled upward, not in surprise but satisfaction. So he already knew. "I am honored to serve His Majesty's will," the Marquis declared. "My daughter will be wed within the fortnight." The hall buzzed with low murmurs. Aurelia stepped out from behind the pillar, her heart pounding. "I'm getting married." She had dreamt of this moment, not in glittering detail but in soft fragments of hope. A home of her own. A husband. A name no longer followed by sneers and whispers. She knew who it was. There was only one noble, unwed and powerful enough to warrant a royal decree. Haldric, the Duke of Eldoria. The king's cousin. The hero of the border wars. A man whose blood was said to hold power, enough to subdue the beasts that prowled beyond the northern range. A man who hadn't smiled once in the 3 days he attended the last winter solstice banquet. A man Aurelia had watched from across the ballroom, tall, proud and utterly unreachable, while she stood against the far wall with the other lesser daughters. He hadn't seen her. Not once. But she had watched him with a kind of breathless ache, the kind that only grows stronger the more hopeless it becomes. And now he would be her husband. "Prepare her," the Marquis ordered. "Send word to the dressmaker. And write a reply to His Majesty. Say we are honored." His gaze shifted to her, dark and sharp. "Don't embarrass me, girl." Aurelia didn't sleep that night. She lay in her narrow bed beneath the servant quarters, staring at the cracked ceiling, the news replaying over and over. She was to be a duchess. And yet nothing changed. No congratulations. No new room. No fine dresses. The maids still looked down on her. Her half-sisters giggled cruelly whenever she walked by, calling her the brothel girl behind their fans. But she endured. She had always endured. Her mother, a woman she never knew, had died giving birth to her. All she had was a worn locket with no picture inside and the vague knowledge that her father had once paid for her mother's time and nothing more. The Marquis had only claimed her when the king took an interest in his loyalty. And what better display than offering his forgotten daughter to the kingdom's most dangerous noble? Aurelia sat by the window that morning, pulling each stitch of her wedding veil by hand. The fabric was thin. She didn't mind. It would still be beautiful. She imagined the Duke's eyes softening when he saw her. Maybe he'd be surprised. Maybe he'd take her hand. Maybe, just maybe, he'd understand the love she already held in her heart for him. Because it hadn't begun with the king's decree. It began the moment she saw him. Flashback. The winter solstice banquet 2 years ago. The grand ballroom of the royal palace was alight with golden chandeliers and music that danced through the air like wind on silk. It was her first time allowed in such an event. Not as a guest, of course, but to stand at the wall with the other lesser-born daughters. Dressed plainly without jewels or fine silks, she was meant to blend into the marble. And yet, for a few precious minutes, Aurelia had felt like the center of her own little world. Because that was the night she first saw him. The Duke of Eldoria entered the ballroom not like a noble, but like a storm in human form. Dressed in black with a silver sash pinned by the royal crest, he walked with the kind of quiet gravity that bent the room's energy around him. The nobles shifted. Conversations faltered. Even the musicians missed a note. He bowed to the king stiffly, no warmth in his gestures, then stood alone by the edge of the dais, arms crossed, eyes scanning the crowd like a hawk surveying its prey. Aurelia couldn't look away. He was not handsome in the way poets described, no soft curls or playful smiles, but there was something striking about him. Unshakable. Scarred by war. Dignified and cold. She had heard the stories, how he'd faced the beasts with only a blade in hand, how his blood carried ancient magic, how even the king feared his power. And yet, as she stood by the pillar, heart pounding, all she could think was how lonely he looked. No one dared approach him. Not even the ladies vying for a royal match. He stood like a man apart, honored and isolated. Then, for one brief heartbeat, his gaze flicked across the hall. She thought it landed on her. Her breath caught. But the moment passed and he looked away. He didn't see her. Her heart had already decided. That was the man she had longed for. The one whose sorrowful strength made her believe that love could be something more than a transaction, more than duty. She had written poems about that night, hidden in the back of old books. She had dreamt of dancing with him once, just once, even if only in her imagination. And now she was to be his wife. He would finally see her. Wouldn't he? Chapter 2. A Wedding in Winter. The rain had not stopped since dawn. It poured over the rooftops of the capital, drumming a relentless rhythm as Lady Aurelia was dressed in silence. There was no music, no joyful chatter, no flurry of giggling maids excited about silks and lace. Just the rustling of her worn gown and the occasional snap of thread as it caught in her nervous fingers. The dress was a pale ivory, stitched by her own hand over long nights by candlelight. It had no embellishments, no royal embroidery, no train. The veil she had sewn with care trembled on her shoulders as she stepped into the waiting carriage. The marquis did not escort her to the cathedral. Instead, a steward accompanied her, a quiet man who did not look her in the eyes once. The ride was short, but the silence stretched long. She stared out the rain-streaked window, watching the capital blur around her. People huddled under awnings. Merchants shouted to be heard through the storm, and distant bells tolled like a dirge rather than a celebration. When the carriage finally stopped in front of the grand cathedral of Arlandia, her heart felt as heavy as the sky. She stepped out alone. The doors of the cathedral opened slowly before her. Rows of noble guests sat stiffly, their expressions unreadable, eyes politely averted. The choir did not sing. The Duke did not smile. He stood at the altar like a soldier awaiting battle, tall, cold, and unmovable. Dressed in deep navy lined with silver, he looked like winter incarnate. His eyes, pale gray like storm clouds over the sea, didn't even flicker when she reached his side. Not once did he meet her gaze. And when the priest spoke the sacred vows, Aurelia's voice trembled with hope. I, Aurelia of House Kerrigan, vow myself to you in heart, soul, and name. The Duke's reply came low and lifeless. I, Haldric of House Eldoria, accept this union under royal decree. Not a single rose adorned the altar. No cheers followed the final pronouncement. The kiss was skipped entirely. By the time they left the cathedral, the rain had turned to sleet. The journey to the Eldoria estate took 2 days by carriage. The Duke said nothing. Aurelia tried once, gently, cautiously, to speak. My lord husband. He didn't answer. He didn't look at her. She turned her face to the window, hiding the sting in her eyes. When they crossed the river Varel and passed into the borderlands, the scenery changed. The lush forests and rolling hills gave way to sharp cliffs and ancient pines. Fog coiled through the trees like ghosts, and somewhere in the distance, a deep, inhuman howl echoed across the sky. Eldoria estate rose from the cliffs like a fortress carved into the bones of the earth. Black stone, towering walls, spiked iron gates. A place built not for beauty, but for war. A place like him. The servants lined up as they entered the manor, all in perfect rows, heads bowed. Not one greeted her with a smile. No one called her Your Grace. Not even the steward. She was shown to the east wing. Her chamber was clean but bare. A single window overlooked the frozen cliffs. The fireplace was cold. That night, a servant left a small meal on a tray beside her door, and nothing else. Her husband did not come. They had not spoken a single word. Days passed. She tried. God's how she tried. She explored the manor politely, respectfully. She greeted every servant. She offered to help in the kitchens, though she was told her place was not among the pots. She began leaving tea outside the Duke's study, blends she had researched to help with fatigue or sleep or cold weather coughs. None were ever touched. Once she left a letter, just a simple note wishing him good health. It was returned with no reply. The steward, an elderly man named Darian, pulled her aside after a week. "My lady," he said softly, almost with pity, "His Grace does not appreciate unsolicited gestures. I would advise you to maintain distance." She bowed her head and nodded, though her heart sank. One evening she found the great hall empty, save for the Duke sitting before the fire with a glass of dark wine. She approached carefully, hands clasped. Her heart thundered in her chest. "My lord," she began, voice gentle, "I know I was not the bride you wished for, but I mean you no harm. I hope that in time you may come to." He stood. His shadow fell over her like a wall of frost. "Save your performance," he said coldly. "You may have fooled the king with your shy eyes and trembling voice, but not me." Aurelia froze. "You're a spy," he continued. "A leash sent by His Majesty. A pawn from your scheming father. Do not pretend otherwise." I'm not," she whispered. I do not care what you claim. I will not play house with a woman I did not choose, especially one with royal eyes watching behind her veil. Stay in your wing. Keep to your games. And never ever think you can warm my heart." With that he turned and left her in the firelight. The room felt colder than the rain outside. That night she curled beneath her thin blankets, her pillow soaked with tears, and held the locket to her chest. I just wanted to be loved. But no one ever had. Not her father. Not her family. Not even the man she gave her heart to from a distance. So, she could not bring herself to hate him. Not yet. Chapter 3. The Duchess of Nothing. The next morning when Aurelia opened her door, the tray of tea she had left for the Duke was still there, untouched, its contents now cold. Her note, carefully written in her best script, had been folded and placed beside it. Unopened. She stood there for a long time staring at it, her hands trembling. Then she picked it all up, returned to her room, and poured the tea into the basin without a word. Her days passed slowly, each one bleeding into the next. No one called her Your Grace. The steward, Darian, only addressed her when necessary, and always with a tight, polite formality, as if he were speaking to a ghost, or a guest who had overstayed her welcome. The other servants rarely looked at her at all. When she entered the hall, their conversations quieted. When she tried to join the garden walk, the maids quickly gathered their baskets and left. In the dining room, her plate was often brought out late, lukewarm, or wrong entirely. And when she tried to offer gentle corrections, her voice was met with practiced indifference. Once she asked for a new shawl. Hers was thin, the edges frayed. She found it in the laundry the next day, restitched in clumsy thread as if to say, "Use what you have." But Aurelia was not soft in spirit, only in heart. She woke early every day before the bells tolled across the keep. She walked the east wing corridors, memorizing every tapestry and broken tile. She watched the sky change colors outside her narrow window, pink, gold, gray. And she wrote letters she never sent. To her mother. To herself. even to the Duke, though she stopped that after the fifth one went unanswered. She taught herself the layout of the kitchen, even though she wasn't allowed inside. She learned the name of the old hound limping near the stables. His name was Gray and he liked dried meat and ear scratches. She learned to braid her own hair in 3 new ways, though no one ever saw her up close to notice. Sometimes she sang softly to herself when she was sure no one was listening. The rooms didn't echo back. Once in the library, a dark, high-ceilinged place that smelled of dust and long-forgotten things, she found an old book of poetry written by the Duke's mother. Her name had been Elaine. The inscription on the inside cover read, "To Haldric, may you one day find someone who sees your light even when you hide it." Aurelia traced the words with her fingers, a lump forming in her throat. So he hadn't always been like this. There was once someone who believed in him too. One evening as she walked along the outer cloister, Aurelia heard voices drifting from the servants' hall. Laughter, low and bitter. "Does she think he'll fall in love with her just because she smiles like a lamb?" one of the younger maids said. "Please. His Grace barely tolerates her." "She's not even proper nobility," said another. "That one was born in a brothel, wasn't she? I heard she begged the king for this marriage. She's just a spy in a pretty dress. A silk-wrapped rat." Aurelia pressed her back against the stone wall, her breath catching. The words sliced through her like shards of glass, not because they were lies, but because some part of her feared they were true. When the laughter faded, she turned and walked away without a sound. That night she removed the veil from her dressing table. She folded it carefully, then placed it inside a small wooden box beneath her bed. She hadn't worn it since the wedding. But until now she'd kept it out in the open, a symbol maybe of hope. A something still waiting. But hope was starting to feel like a cruelty she inflicted upon herself. The next day she asked the steward for permission to see the accounting ledgers. He blinked at her in surprise. "Why would your ladyship need to see those?" "I wish to learn more about the estate's workings," she said. "My husband has no need of me elsewhere. Perhaps I can at least be useful." He hesitated but eventually relented. She spent the next 3 days in the study reviewing old records, cost of grain, losses from recent winters, beast ward maintenance schedules. She wasn't trained in finance, but she was clever and patient. And there was something comforting about numbers. They didn't lie. They didn't whisper behind her back. For the first time she felt a flicker of control. A place, however small, where she could belong. On the 4th day, as she sat cross-legged on the study floor, papers scattered around her, the door opened. She looked up. It was the Duke. Haldric. He stared at her, brows drawn in clear disapproval. "I study," he said flatly. "I was only reading," she said, rising to her feet quickly. "I asked the steward." "I meant no offense, my lord." For a moment his eyes scanned the room. The ink on her fingers, the meticulous notes, the old ledgers. Then without a word he turned and left. The door closed behind him. And for the first time since her arrival, Aurelia smiled just a little, because he hadn't told her to stop. Chapter 4. A soft shift. Winter deepened across the borderlands, and frost kissed every window in Eldoria estate. Each morning Aurelia lit her own fire and dressed without assistance. Her gowns were growing thinner, threadbare at the cuffs, but she wore them with dignity. She braided her hair, pinned it up herself, and always walked with quiet purpose, even when no one greeted her. But one morning something was different. A small fire had already been lit when she awoke. And there was a new shawl folded at the foot of her bed, thicker, finely made, lined with soft fur along the edges. She touched it carefully, fingers brushing the weave. Not coarse like the old mended one. This had been made recently. On purpose. She asked no one. Said nothing. But when she passed through the servant hallway later that day, her eyes met those of a kitchen maid, a girl with nervous hands and strawberry blonde hair tucked beneath a bonnet. The girl dipped into a quick, guilty curtsy. Aurelia nodded once, gently, and moved on. It was not much. But it was the first thread of warmth she'd felt in weeks. A sign, however small, that perhaps not everyone in the manor hated her. Later that week she returned to the Duke's study to finish reading through the estate's records. She sat on the floor again, documents spread around her like fallen leaves. Her fingers were ink-stained, her lips murmuring numbers under her breath. She didn't hear the footsteps this time, but she felt a presence, a shift in the room's air. Haldric stood just beyond the doorframe. He didn't speak, just stood there watching her. Their eyes met. For a moment, Aurelia felt her heart lift, the tiniest spark of connection, of recognition. But then his gaze dropped to the papers in her lap. "You are not a steward," he said quietly. "I don't claim to be," she replied, steady and calm. "But no one else was reviewing the winter supplies. The storerooms are poorly stocked. There's not enough dried grain to last until spring." Haldric's brow furrowed slightly. He said nothing. Aurelia held his gaze. "I can help. I'm not asking for your trust. Just your permission to work." A long silence. Then finally he gave a short nod. "Do what you like." He turned and left, his coat billowing behind him, but this time he did not close the door. And that, too, was something. On the 7th day of snow, a servant brought a tray to her chambers, breakfast still warm and a fresh-cut flower resting on the edge of the plate. A winter crocus. They didn't grow nearby. Aurelia held it in her fingers, smiling faintly. Hope was still painful, but no longer a cruelty. Chapter 5. The Letters That Never Spoke. The letter arrived in midwinter, carried not by an official courier, but by a traveling monk from the southern abbey, someone no one would think to question. Aurelia found it placed beneath her chamber door. The seal was plain, the wax a dull green-gray. But she recognized the script instantly. Her father. She read the contents with trembling hands. "You are to observe all that the Duke does, who he speaks with, where his power is focused, the condition of the warding stones and how frequently they are maintained. You will report every month. Do not forget your place." It was not a request. It was an order. She burned the letter in the hearth. Watched the parchment blacken and curl to ash, the seal melting like wax tears. Aurelia sat before the fire long after the last ember faded, hands resting on her lap. She could have complied. She could have bought herself her father's favor. Maybe a little protection. A lifeline. But something inside her, small, battered but still fiercely whole, refused. Haldric might never love her. He might never trust her. But she would not become the tool of the very men who saw her as nothing more than a pawn. That evening, as snow gathered on the windowsills, she passed by the upper corridor and caught a glimpse of Haldric in the war chamber. The heavy doors were cracked open. He stood in front of a long table covered in maps, warding diagrams and scattered reports. One gloved hand rested on the edge, the other pressed to his brow. He looked exhausted. Thinner than when she first arrived. His shoulders bore the weight of something far greater than a title. As she watched, one of the ward commanders entered the room. "My lord," he said, his voice low. "We've lost another outer post. The barrier stones failed again." Haldric didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was hoarse. "Dispatch a repair team. And tell them to take the silverwood charms from the inner walls if they must. But that will weaken the estate." "I know," he snapped. "Do it anyway." The commander bowed and left. Haldric stood alone again, surrounded by a kingdom slowly unraveling. Aurelia stepped back before he could sense her presence. She returned to her chambers in silence. The next morning she wrote her father a letter. A blank one. No ink. No words. No lies. She sealed it and gave it to the traveling monk who passed through again on his return to the capital. Let her silence speak for her. Days passed. Aurelia continued her quiet work, helping the steward with winter allocations, overseeing repairs in the servant quarters, even sitting in on one of the estate council meetings when one of the lesser lords refused to cooperate. Aurelia didn't stop her. But more than that, he started noticing. Sometimes she'd catch him lingering in the hallway when she gave quiet instructions to a maid. Once she found a copy of her annotated ledgers neatly placed on his desk. Her handwriting. His ink. No comment. No praise. But no dismissal either. One evening, just before the hearth was lit, she found herself standing in the West Wing gallery, where the portraits of past dukes and duchesses hung. It was a long hall. Silent. At the far end she saw him, Haldric, standing before a portrait of a woman with dark auburn hair and a gentle smile. The only portrait without a matching pair. Aurelia stepped quietly beside him. She was beautiful, she said. He didn't flinch. Didn't look at her. "My mother," he said after a long silence. "She died when I was 16. Beast attack during a border breach. I'm sorry. She was the only one who ever believed I could do more than just kill things." He finally turned his eyes toward her, not cold this time. Not angry. Just tired. "Why are you still here?" Aurelia's throat tightened. He wasn't asking out of cruelty. He was asking out of confusion. She met his gaze. "Because someone has to stay." Chapter 6. The Beast Tide. The first sign came with the howling. Low, deep, and not quite human, the kind of sound that didn't just echo through the hills but sank into bone. Aurelia was in the library when it started. At first she thought it was wind, a strong draft pushing against the old windows. But when the steward burst into the room moments later, face pale and trembling, she knew better. "They've breached the southern ridge," he said. "The beasts have begun to gather." The estate changed overnight. Men strapped on armor in the courtyard. Messages flew in and out of the war tower like flocks of birds. Servants scrambled to pack supplies, the halls filled with footsteps and fear. Every few hours a bell would ring, long and hollow, signaling updates from the front. Aurelia watched it all from the edges. No one gave her orders. No one informed her of the evacuation plans. No one told her where she was meant to go. Haldric didn't speak to her before he left. She stood on the upper steps as he mounted his horse, armor shining beneath the dawn light, his expression hard as stone. He looked up at the estate once. She hoped he might search for her face in the windows. Might say something. Anything. But he only turned his steed and rode out, 100 men at his back, their black and silver banners slicing through the wind. By nightfall the manor was nearly empty. Wagons rolled out of the gates with staff, supplies, and officials bound for the fortified safe zone farther inland. The steward didn't stop to say goodbye. The maids didn't look at her as they passed. In her chambers Aurelia packed a single bag. Just in case. But no one came for her. No one knocked on her door. No one said her name. No one even noticed she was missing. She stood alone in the entry hall as the final cart rattled away, its wheels kicking up frost and mud. Silence fell over the estate like a shroud. That night the sky glowed red on the horizon, fire from the outer watchtowers. The barrier stones had begun to fail. Haldric and his men would be fighting in the frost-covered mountains, defending a kingdom that sent spies to his table and poison to his court. Aurelia sat by the cold hearth, wrapped in her fur shawl, and felt something inside her go very, very still. She had spent 2 years in this place, trying to earn a place that was never offered. She had been ignored, dismissed, belittled, forgotten. And now, even in danger, even when death itself loomed over the land, she was still invisible. Not a duchess. Not a woman. Not even a liability. Just air. It happened slowly. She packed what little she had. Old dresses, her comb, her mother's locket, and a few coins she'd saved from small allowances. She stood in front of the tall mirror one last time, studying the woman in the reflection. Thin. Black hair. Eyes bruised with sleeplessness. But her back was straight. Her jaw was set. There were no tears left. Only clarity. "I won't be waiting when you return," she whispered to the empty room. She took one final thing from the drawer, her wedding bracelet. Silver engraved with the Eldoria crest. She left it on her pillow. Before dawn she slipped through the hidden servant passage that led beyond the inner walls. She wore a thick cloak and a hood drawn low. The road was frozen, the wind sharp. But she walked without fear. She didn't look back. Not at the keep. Not at the cliffs. Not at the life she was leaving behind. By the time the sun rose, the Duchess of Eldoria had vanished. Chapter 7. The Things She Left Behind. The beast tide lasted 17 days. Haldric lost 23 men. 2 outposts fell. And the southern wall's ruins nearly collapsed under the surge of corrupted magic. But they held. They always did. He rode through the blackened trees, blood dried on his gloves, his voice hoarse from issuing commands. His sword arm ached from overuse, his head from lack of sleep. His armor was dented at the shoulder, and the silver trim of his cloak had been scorched by beast fire. Yet all he could think of was warmth. The quiet relief of the estate. The return to silence. And, despite himself, the mansion was a hollow shell when he arrived. No banners fluttered from the battlements. The guards at the gate were replacements. Unfamiliar faces, temporary hands. The courtyard echoed with the sound of distant repairs and the weary shuffle of returning servants. Haldric dismounted wordlessly and handed off the reins. The steward met him at the stairs. Bowed. Gave a brief update. The east wing, where she stayed, had been locked since evacuation. No one had entered since. Haldric frowned. Did she not go with the others? The steward hesitated. We believed she did, Your Grace. She wasn't accounted for, but in the confusion. Haldric turned on his heel, cape snapping behind him. He walked to her chambers. The door creaked open with a soft groan, heavy with silence. The fire was long dead. The air stale and cold. Dust floated in the slanting light through the window. Everything was untouched. And yet, everything was gone. No jewelry on the dressing table. No gowns in the wardrobe. No letters. No sign of a hurried escape. Only a single item lay on the bed. Her silver ring. The same one he had slipped on her finger the day they married. He hadn't looked her in the eyes when he did it. He hadn't said a word. Haldric crossed the room, picked it up slowly. His thumb traced the familiar engraving. It was warm from the sunlight, but it felt like death in his hand. He found the chest beneath her bed. Unlocked. Inside, carefully folded clothes. Each one worn thin at the seams. Some patched with uneven thread. Not the wardrobe of a noblewoman, but a servant who mended what she could rather than ask for more. His chest tightened. He lifted a book nestled beneath the fabric. A diary. He read the first page. Then the second. Then the third. Her handwriting was neat even in places where the ink had blurred, from time or maybe tears. Today I greeted the steward. He didn't look at me. I smiled anyway. I left tea for him again. He didn't drink it, but I brewed a gentler blend this time. Maybe it was too bitter before. The maids laugh when I pass. But I know I mustn't cry in front of them. A duchess doesn't cry. The entries went on. Some short. Some too painful to finish. There was nothing in them about spying. Nothing about betrayal. Only hope. Longing. Pain. Love. He was beautiful the first time I saw him. I wish he had looked at me just once. I wonder if he knows that I've never told my father anything. I think I was born to be invisible. The last entry was nearly 2 years old. Haldric sat there, the book open on his knees, the ring still in his hand. He didn't move. The silence screamed around him. He remembered her hands, always folded gently, never raised in anger. The way she stood a little straighter every time someone ignored her, like she refused to bend even when the world told her she didn't matter. He remembered the tea left outside his door. The faint smell of lavender in the halls. The crocus on the breakfast tray. He'd ordered the cook to add it but never told her why. He remembered her words in the gallery. Because someone has to stay. And he hadn't even asked her to. He stood abruptly, fists clenched. Darian, he bellowed, voice sharp enough to shake the windows. The steward rushed in moments later, startled. Your Grace. Send search parties. Immediately. My lord. She's not dead, Haldric said. She left. And I let her. He turned toward the window, gaze locked on the mountains. I didn't lose a spy. I lost a woman who loved me. And I never even gave her a reason to stay. Chapter 8. The Funeral of the Duchess. Haldric didn't understand the depth of his own grief until he stood at the edge of the cliff. He was alone when he first received the news that Aurelia had vanished. No body was found. No sign of her in the wilds or the borderland. Just the belongings she left behind, and the quiet, gnawing realization that his wife had not fled, but chosen to leave him behind. They declared her dead. It wasn't an official funeral, not by any means, but the kingdom needed closure. The Duchess had vanished, and Eldoria needed to show its people that they were still strong, still united. So the Duke stood on the cliffs outside his ancestral home and he said the words. He said them because tradition demanded it. He said them because his advisors told him it would give the people peace. But the words felt like ash in his mouth. Aurelia of House Eldoria. He spoke to the wind, the waves crashing below. Beloved wife, faithful consort, may the gods guide her into their arms. The crowd was small. The lords who had come for appearances, the servants too frightened to leave the grounds. The rest of the kingdom, the soldiers, the farmers, they stayed behind, whispering about the rumored death of the duke's wife, the fallen duchess who had been so quiet, so invisible. Aurelia was already a story to them. Haldric could hardly stand the sight of the empty grave that had been prepared. It was wrong. Everything about this was wrong. There had been no body. No blood. No proof. Only the empty space beside him. He never realized how little he knew about his wife. How little he had bothered to understand her. The small kindnesses she'd given him were nothing more than ghosts now. The quiet days by the fire. The endless patience she had shown him even as he pushed her further away. Later, when the last of the mourners left, Haldric went to the chapel alone. He walked to the back, to the small alcove where Aurelia had always sat. The candlelight flickered in the silence, illuminating the worn wood of the pew, the faded tapestries, the small statue of the goddess she had always prayed to in secret. Haldric knelt before the altar. His thoughts were a blur, confusion mixing with rage, regret, and guilt. Why? He thought. Why had she left? Why had she vanished without a trace? Why had he treated her so coldly when she had never once given up on him? He had never been the man who could offer affection, not truly. He had never allowed himself to care for anything except his kingdom, his duty, and his power. He thought that was enough. But now, with Aurelia gone, with her gone in a way that felt more like betrayal than disappearance, he realized how empty his life had always been. Days passed. Weeks. Haldric's obsession with finding her began to consume him. He ordered his men to scour the borderlands. He had his spies and scouts sent in every direction. No stone was left unturned. He combed the capital and the nearby villages, offering rewards for any sign of her. The world turned against him. News from the front lines turned sour. Beast attacks increased. The warding stones were failing faster than they could be repaired. The nobles grew restless and whispers of rebellion filled the air. But Haldric was numb to it all. The kingdom fell apart and he could only think of the woman he had ignored for 2 years. One evening, after months of fruitless searching, Haldric sat in his study, staring at the map of the kingdom. The fireplace burned low, casting shadows across the room. He opened the drawer, pulling out the diary she had left behind, the same one he had found in her chambers. Her words haunted him. He doesn't see me. I wish he would. I'm just a shadow. He closed his eyes. The words hit him like a blow. Why did I never see her? He asked himself. Why was I so blind? He could feel the weight of her absence, the empty space beside him that could never be filled. And it was then, in that moment of brutal self-awareness, that Haldric made a vow. He would change. He would rebuild this kingdom and he would find her. In the coming days, Haldric began to plan. The kingdom teetered on the edge of rebellion and the king had grown weak. Corruption bled through the court like a disease, and the nobles who had once whispered about his weakness now openly criticized his decisions. But Haldric no longer cared for their opinions. He had a new purpose. And it had nothing to do with the king. Nothing to do with power. It was about retribution. A need to prove that he could be more than just a shadow of his family name. He would tear down the kingdom's corrupt heart. He would fight for the throne, not for himself but for her. To honor the woman he had never known. He would take back the crown. And once he was king he would make amends. Chapter 9, The Name She Chose. The journey across the borderlands was harsh and long. Aurelia had little more than a bag of clothes, a pouch of coins, and a will that refused to die, even if her heart had cracked in two. She passed through small villages where no one asked her name. Towns ravaged by the same beasts the Duke fought tooth and nail to keep at bay. Refugees scattered like seeds in the wind. By the time she reached the edge of the neighboring kingdom, the name Eldoria was nothing but ash in her throat. She told the merchant she met her name was Arya. Just Arya. No titles. No house. No past. He was old, kind-eyed, with a caravan of cloth, spices and tanned leather. He needed extra hands. She needed to disappear. It was a simple trade. She traveled with them for months. Washing, packing, stitching. Learning to mend with steady fingers, to haggle with merchants, to cook over open flames. There was freedom in anonymity. Peace in the ordinary. No one expected her to bow. No one scorned her for being silent. No one looked at her with disappointment. She smiled more. It was small at first, broken at the edges, but real. She found a strange joy in the life of the road. In eating by firelight. In sleeping beneath canvas while rain danced above. In the way strangers spoke to her without suspicion. She was clever, quick with numbers and graceful with words, and for the first time in her life that was enough. The merchant's wife taught her how to sew stronger hems. His daughter taught her how to fight with a dagger. His son, quiet, bookish and sunburned, once asked her if she'd ever been in love. She had smiled and said, once. He didn't ask again. After a year she bought her own stall. A small one, nestled in a border town market, painted with soft blue trim. She sold dried herbs, trinkets and hand-woven charms, things people could carry for protection or comfort. The villagers called her Miss Aurea, and some believed she was a hedge healer or a minor witch. She never corrected them. She liked the stories. They were better than the truth. And still sometimes at night she would dream. Of cold stone corridors. Of a silver bracelet. Of dark eyes that never looked her way until it was too late. She would wake with her hand over her heart, breathing hard. But then she'd rise, make tea and begin her day. Not as a duchess. Not as a shadow. But as herself. Chapter 10. The Dawn of Rebellion. Haldric's world had always been one of power, duty and cold calculation. But the disappearance of his wife had cracked the foundation of his carefully built life, and now a storm raged within him. The kingdom was slowly crumbling, its corruption festering in every corner. The people whispered of rebellion. The nobles stirred restlessly, sensing weakness. And Haldric knew there would be no peace until he acted. He could no longer pretend that his grief was the only thing worth tending. No longer could he keep the illusion of duty alive while the kingdom suffered. Aurelia's memory, the love he had ignored, burned like fire in his chest, pushing him toward the only path that could bring him any form of redemption. He stood at the edge of the balcony overlooking the city below. The flickering lights of torches in the distance reminded him of the flames that had consumed his heart after Aurelia disappeared. His fingers gripped the railing, his knuckles white as the words he had longed to say but never dared to whisper formed in his mind. The kingdom needed a new king. It was no longer about vengeance for Aurelia. It was no longer just about him. Haldric had never cared for politics or diplomacy. But now, after years of emotional neglect and bitter isolation, he understood what the kingdom needed. Leadership. A force to break the rot that had infested it from within. And he would be that force. Haldric had always been a man of calculated moves. But now his actions were driven by a desperate, raw hunger for change. He summoned his most loyal supporters. The commanders who had fought beside him in the border battles. The few nobles who had not sold their souls to the king. These men and women were all that was left of a once proud kingdom, and they were the ones Haldric needed to start the rebellion. The secret meetings took place in the dim-lit chambers beneath the castle, away from prying eyes. Haldric's face was set in a grim line as he addressed them. "The king is weak," he began, his voice low but filled with conviction. "He's surrounded by corrupt men who only seek to profit from the kingdom's suffering. He is blind to what this kingdom needs. A strong hand, a ruler who understands the pulse of the people." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Haldric's eyes burned with determination. "I will take the throne and I will restore Valyria to its former glory. We will purge the court of those who have poisoned our land. And we will rebuild the kingdom in the image of strength and honor." The rebellion began in the shadows, its whispers spreading like wildfire. Rumors of Haldric's discontent with the king reached every corner of the capital. The nobles who had long awaited a change in power began to make their moves. The soldiers who had always followed Haldric's commands without question, began to rally under his banner. But Haldric knew this wouldn't be easy. The king had his own army, his own loyalists who would fight tooth and nail to maintain their control. The kingdom would be torn asunder before it could be reborn. Over the next few weeks, Haldric's grip on power tightened. He called in favors, made alliances with neighboring lords who had been too afraid to act until now. The war for the throne had begun and there was no turning back. But even as Haldric gathered his forces, the question that haunted him was always the same. What if Aurelia were still out there? At night, when the battle plans were drawn and the soldiers prepared for their first clash with the king's forces, Haldric would retreat to his private quarters. He would open the diary once more. He would read the words she had written, words that had burned themselves into his memory. I wonder if he knows that I've never told my father anything. I think I was born to be invisible. He couldn't forget them. He couldn't forget her. Haldric stood before the mirror in his study, his reflection staring back at him. His armor gleamed in the soft light of the candle, a stark contrast to the dark thoughts that consumed him. He was no longer the cold Duke of Eldoria. He was a man at war, with himself, with his kingdom, and with the ghosts of the past. And then came the news. It was a scout who brought the word, an eyewitness report from the borderlands. Your Grace, we found something. A merchant caravan has passed through the northern reaches. They say they've seen a woman who fits the description of the Duchess. Haldric's heart stopped. The scout continued, she goes by the name Aurelia now. She's in a small town near the border selling herbs and trinkets. We can't be sure if it's her, but the description fits. Haldric's mind raced. Could it be? He had never believed she had truly died, but the thought of her living under a false name, hidden away in some border town, it was almost too much to bear. He gave the order immediately. He would find her. As the rebellion raged on outside the castle walls, Haldric's heart raced with an entirely different purpose. The king's forces could wait. He would deal with them in due time. But first he needed to find Aurelia, the woman he had once called his wife, the woman who had somehow survived the fire of their broken marriage. He would go to the border where she had vanished and he would bring her back. But the road ahead was uncertain. The rebellion was growing. The kingdom was slipping into chaos. And Haldric knew that no matter what happened, nothing would ever be the same again. Chapter 11. The Search for Aurelia. Haldric's heart raced with an unfamiliar urgency. Every step he took, every mile that separated him from the palace, felt like a step into the unknown. The rebellion was a fire he had set, but now he found himself chasing a different kind of heat, one that had burned in his chest since the day he realized how little he had known of his wife. The borderlands were treacherous, even more so now that the kingdom was in turmoil. The lands beyond his duchy were wild, untamed by any authority but the beasts that roamed there. Haldric's mind was consumed with a single thought: find her. He rode with a small group of trusted soldiers, men who had stood by him when he was still just a duke with an uncertain future. Now they were more than that, they were his inner circle and they were determined to see the rebellion through. But none of them knew the real reason Haldric had left the capital. None of them knew that the rebellion was no longer his primary concern. The town near the border where Aurelia was supposed to be was small, its streets winding through narrow alleys and quiet squares. Haldric could feel the tension in the air, the same tension that had filled his own heart since he had ordered the search. It was impossible to ignore the whispers among his soldiers, the unease in their eyes as they spoke of the beasts that still terrorized the land. But Haldric was not focused on those threats. His mind was fixed on a single goal: finding her. When they finally arrived, the town felt like a world apart from the kingdom he had left behind. There were no grand banners, no bustling markets of the capital, just simple people going about their business, trying to survive in a place that felt disconnected from the rest of the kingdom. They visited the local tavern, a dusty, quiet place where a few travelers huddled around wooden tables, murmuring in low voices. Haldric's eyes scanned the room, looking for anyone who might know something about Aurelia. He couldn't help but wonder if she even knew he was searching for her. One of the regulars, an older man with a thick beard and weathered face, noticed Haldric's presence. He seemed to recognize the military uniform, the unmistakable aura of power that still clung to Haldric despite the man's disheveled appearance. "Lost someone, my lord?" the man asked gruffly, his voice tinged with suspicion. Haldric's eyes narrowed, but he didn't show his frustration. The man didn't know who he was and Haldric didn't want to reveal his identity just yet. Instead he nodded, keeping his tone neutral. "A woman," Haldric said. "Goes by the name Aurelia. Seen her?" The man squinted at him for a moment, then sighed, clearly not thrilled to be drawn into anything. But there was something in Haldric's gaze, something that made the man pause. "Aurelia, huh? The healer lady," the man mused, scratching his chin. "She's a quiet one, keeps to herself. Been here for about a year, I reckon. Runs a little shop near the market. Sells herbs and charms. Some folks say she's a witch, but that's just talk." Haldric's pulse quickened. This was the lead he had been waiting for. "Where is she?" Haldric asked, his voice low. The man pointed down the road toward the edge of the market. "You'll find her there. She doesn't like being bothered much, though. Best you don't make a scene." Haldric thanked the man, then nodded to his soldiers, signaling them to stay behind. He didn't want to appear like the Duke of Eldoria here. In this small town he was just another man looking for answers. As he made his way toward the market, the familiar tension in his chest began to rise. Every step felt heavier than the last. What if Arya didn't want to see him? What if she had built a new life, a life without him, without the pain and coldness he had given her? What if she had learned to love herself, to be free of the chains he had bound her with? The market was small, with narrow streets lined with wooden stalls and colorful tents. The air was thick with the smell of herbs and spices, but Haldric's mind was focused on one thing: the shop. He found it at the far end of the market, tucked between a bakery and a butcher's stall. The sign hanging above the door read "Arya's Remedies" in faded paint, but Haldric could see that the shop had been well kept. It wasn't much, but it was clear that Arya had made this place her own. Haldric paused outside the door, his breath catching in his throat. He had dreamed of this moment, imagined it 100 times in the quiet solitude of his chambers. But now that the moment had come, he wasn't sure what to say. He pushed open the door. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped inside, and the warm scent of dried herbs greeted him. The shop was simple but tidy, filled with shelves of jars and vials, neatly labeled and arranged. But his gaze was immediately drawn to the woman standing behind the counter. She was bent over a small workbench, carefully grinding dried herbs into a powder. Her hair, once black, was now a soft auburn, her face softer than he remembered. She wore a simple linen dress, a far cry from the elaborate gowns of the Duchess. She didn't look like the woman he had once ignored. She looked like someone who had finally found peace. And then she looked up. For a brief moment time seemed to freeze. Her eyes widened, a flicker of recognition crossing her face before she masked it with indifference. Haldric felt his heart stop. She was standing before him, but it was as if they were worlds apart. The years, the pain, the emptiness, it all came rushing back. She was still here, still alive, but everything had changed. Aurelia was no longer the woman he had once married. He was someone new. "May I help you?" she asked coolly, her voice calm and controlled. Haldric swallowed hard, his throat dry. He stepped forward, fighting the urge to beg her to recognize him, to see the man he had become. "Aurelia. It's me." Her gaze flickered to his, a shadow passing over her face before she lowered her eyes to her work again. She didn't respond immediately. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice quieter now, though still distant. Haldric's chest tightened. There was no more denying it. The woman who stood before him wasn't the same as the one who had loved him so deeply. She had moved on. Chapter 12. The Wall Between Us. The scent of herbs clung to the air like memory, warm and familiar, but the silence between them was cold, cutting. Haldric stood at the threshold of Arya's shop, the same man she had once dreamed of, and the same man who had broken her in ways words couldn't name. And she stood before him not as the meek duchess he had ignored, but as a woman remade by abandonment, grief, and the cruel clarity of freedom. "I know who you are," she said, her voice tight, her gaze cold. "You don't need to say your name." Haldric's throat tightened. "Then you know why I've come." Aurelia turned her back to him, deliberately going back to her workbench. "If you've come for forgiveness, turn around. You won't find it here." Her voice was a blade. And yet, Haldric stepped closer. "I didn't come for forgiveness," he said, steadying his voice. "I came for you." She laughed, not kindly, not warmly, but with the sharpness of someone who had bled dry. "You came for me," she spat, spinning around. "Now, after years of pretending I didn't exist? After watching me rot in your house like furniture you didn't know how to throw out?" Haldric flinched but didn't back down. "I was wrong. I was blind." "No. You chose to be blind." The words hit like arrows. Her eyes, once warm and filled with silent hope, now burned with fury. "Do you remember what you said the day we married?" she demanded. "No, you probably don't. Because you never looked at me. You never heard me." "I was protecting myself," he said, his voice cracking under the weight of old wounds. "The king used you to spy on me." "I never sent him a single word," she shouted. I was desperate to be trusted and loved. I worshipped the very ground you walked on. Tears welled in her eyes but didn't fall, she refused to let them. And you made me feel like filth. Like I was something to be ashamed of. Something you were forced to bear. Haldric stepped forward, his voice rough with guilt. I thought you were part of their trap. That you were like them. And when did I ever act like them? Her voice trembled now, raw and aching. Did I lie to you? Did I ever do anything but try? He couldn't answer. He couldn't find the words. So she kept going because this was her first and only chance to be heard. I starved for a kind word from you. Do you know that? I would fix my dress with needle and thread just so you wouldn't see the holes. I smiled when your servants called me a ghost. I tried so hard to be good, to be worthy, even when your eyes said I never would be. Her voice broke. And still, I waited. I waited years. Haldric stared at her, his own throat burning now. I didn't know, he whispered. I didn't see it. You didn't want to see it, she screamed. And the shop went silent. The wind outside stirred the herbs hanging from the ceiling. Lucien took a breath that tasted like ash. I never deserved you, he said finally, voice hoarse. But I want to now. I want to make it right. Aurelia's eyes glistened, her voice softening, but not with affection. With sorrow. You want me now that I'm gone. Now that I'm someone else. But what you want is a version of me that waited. That version died, Haldric. The night I realized not one soul in that cold mansion would notice if I disappeared. She looked at him like a wound freshly torn. I died for you once. I won't do it again. Haldric stepped forward anyway, closing the space between them. He looked desperate now, like a man trying to grab onto something already slipping away. I know I was cruel. I know I don't deserve you, he said, barely above a whisper. But I can't walk away from you. Not again. Aurelia shook her head. You don't get to say that. He reached out just once, to touch her hand. And she pulled away like his skin burned her. You can't love what you never took the time to see, she said, her voice shaking. You loved the idea of me, the regret of me. But the real me? You let her die. He stood there, stunned, hollow as she turned her back again. You should go, Your Grace, she said coldly. He hesitated for one more breath, one more second, and then turned toward the door, his heart splintering with every step. The bell above the shop door rang once. And then it was quiet again. Chapter 13. Cracks in the Crown. The ride back to camp felt longer than it should have. The landscape passed by in a blur, but Haldric barely saw any of it. His soldiers rode behind him in silence, sensing something had shifted. Their commander, their king in the making, had returned from the border with no triumph in his eyes. No pride. Just silence. His fists were clenched around the reins the whole way. Not from anger. From the kind of pain that no sword could draw. He had finally seen her again. And she had looked through him. When they reached the rebel encampment tucked deep in the forest near the capital, the mood was tense. The rebellion had reached a boiling point. Skirmishes were breaking out. Nobles once loyal to the king were beginning to fracture. The people were starving, angry, and desperate for change. But Haldric? He could barely breathe. That night he stood alone in the war tent. Maps lay sprawled before him, candles flickering. His generals spoke, their voices a blur. My lord, the eastern garrisons have begun pulling back. The king's forces are thinning. The noble house of Kerrigan is ready to declare. Strike before midsummer and we can take the capital. But Haldric didn't answer. All he could see was her face. Finally he slammed his hand down on the table. The room fell silent. I need a moment. They filed out quickly, leaving him in the dark, save for the dim flickering of candlelight. He stared at the map. The capital. The crown. The war. It all meant nothing if she wasn't there to see who he'd become. Meanwhile in the quiet town, Aurelia couldn't sleep. The confrontation had left her hollow. Her hands shook as she boiled water for tea, but she wasn't cold. She was afraid, not of Haldric, not even of his return. But of what he had stirred in her. The worst part of it all? A part of her still loved him. She had buried that part deep beneath every scar, every night spent crying in a bed she wasn't welcome in. But seeing him again, hearing the crack in his voice, seeing the sorrow in his eyes, it had cracked something inside her. He had changed. But had she? As the town quieted for the night, She walked to the back of her shop and opened the old, worn chest that held her few belongings from her past life. Inside lay her mother's hairpin, a memento she never wore because she was afraid of remembering. Next to it, hidden beneath a folded cloth, was her old diary, one she'd begun just after faking her death. She opened it, her handwriting crisp, angry, hopeful. Page after page she had written letters she never sent. Letters to Haldric. Letters about how she missed him. How she hated him. How she wondered if he ever thought of her. She clutched the book to her chest and whispered to the darkness, "Why did you come back now?" The next day, news arrived like a lightning strike. The rebellion was moving. And worse, the fighting was creeping closer to the town. Soldiers loyal to the king were sweeping border towns for supplies, for spies, and for traitors. One merchant caravan was stopped and searched. Another was burned. Aria's shop, though small and discreet, was not invisible. A neighbor warned her. "They think the rebels are hiding in the villages. You should lie low, Aria." But it was too late for that. That evening she stepped outside for air and saw them, riders cloaked in black approaching the town square. Panic spread. Mothers grabbed their children. Shopkeepers shuttered doors. And Aurelia stood frozen, heart pounding. She wasn't sure if they were his men. Or the king's. She had run once. Disappeared. Burned her identity. Could she do it again? Did she even want to? Haldric stood at the edge of the war tent, overlooking the hills that surrounded the capital's outer ring. The kingdom was on its knees. His army was waiting for one word to march. But his heart wasn't on the battlefield. His mind was with the woman he'd broken, and the fire she'd risen from. "Find her," he told his most trusted knight. "Guard her. Don't interfere. Just make sure I don't lose her again." The next morning, before the sun crested the hills, Aurelia packed a single satchel. She left everything else, her tools, her ledgers, even her diary. It was time to move. But as she stepped outside into the foggy gray of morning, a cloaked figure was already waiting for her. Not a soldier. Sir Theron. Haldric's knight. He bowed. "My lady," he said quietly. "The Lord sent me to protect you." From afar. She narrowed her eyes. "And now?" His expression shifted. "Now, I'm here to ask. Will you come with me?" She didn't answer immediately. Behind her the town still slept. In front of her the road curved into uncertainty. But somewhere beyond it, there was a man waiting. A war waiting. And maybe, just maybe, a future. Chapter 14. Where Ashes and Crowns Collide. The rebel stronghold sat nestled in the cradle of the northern cliffs, half lost beneath cloud and snow. Wind howled through the mountain basin like a memory, old, angry, and unwilling to die. Stone walls rose from the earth, not in defiance but in quiet resilience. It was a place meant to be forgotten. But nothing was hidden anymore. Not with the king's banners stirring on the horizon. Not with Haldric sharpening steel beneath stormlight. And not with Aurelia returning from the grave. She stepped down from the wagon just after dusk. The camp, already subdued by cold and fear, fell into silence. All eyes turned toward her. Some with disbelief. Others with dread. To many she was a ghost. A whispered rumor. The Duke's dead wife, or so they'd been told. And yet there she stood. Alive. Changed. Wearing plain wool and the remnants of a name she no longer claimed. From across the camp the tent flaps shifted. Haldric emerged, half-armored, jaw set from too many sleepless nights. His steps faltered when he saw her. For a moment the war, the mountain, the cold, they vanished. There was only Aurelia. "Aurelia," he breathed. "I just want to live," she said, her voice low and steady. She looked past him toward the cliffs where the mist clung like breath on glass. "Because my father rides with the king's army." Haldric went still. Like stone struck by frost. "The marquis?" She nodded once, the gesture sharp as flint. Her voice chilled. "He signed my death warrant in the king's own ink." Inside the command tent, no one spoke her name. She did not approach the war table. Did not ask for strategy. Let them calculate odds and draw lines across maps. She had already lived what they feared. "I'm not here to fight him," she said softly. "I'm here to face him. One last time." At dawn the horn sounded. He did not take up a sword. Instead she walked the refugee lines, weaving through the wounded and the weary. She helped a boy find his mother, wrapped a blanket around an old woman's shoulders, held a stranger's hand while the sky cracked open. She stood at the edge of war not to strike, but to withstand. And in the valley below the king's army came. A sea of steel and red banners, their march relentless like time. And at its head, his armor polished, his expression untouched by wind or shame, rode the Marquis of Carrigan. Her father, the man who gave her life, and tried to end it. She did not come to forgive him. She came to survive him. Chapter 15. What remains after fire? The battlefield reeked of ash and silence. What the fire hadn't taken, the wind had scattered. Smoke drifted in thin ribbons across the charred tents, and the earth was wet with more than rain. Flags lay torn, half buried in the mud. The last of the cries had faded. Only the crows remained. And at the center of it all, bound, bruised, and kneeling in the cold, was her father. The Marquis of Carrigan. Once the king's mouthpiece. Once the terror of courtrooms and war councils. Now a man shackled at the wrists, clothes torn, blood drying at his collar. Still he held his chin high. As if shame could not touch him. As if ruin was just another rumor to ignore. He looked up when she approached. His gaze narrowed, sharp and bitter. So, he said, "You survived." Arya did not answer. The wind pulled at her hood, tugging strands of hair free. Ash clung to her boots as she stepped closer. "You should have stayed in the shadows," he said. "That's where filth belongs." She paused a few paces from him. Not close enough to strike. Not far enough to retreat. Her voice was soft. Steady. "And I'm not here for revenge." His lip curled. "Then why come at all?" She tilted her head slightly, watching him the way one might watch the final embers of a fire that had long since burned out. "To see it," she murmured. "To see the man who tried to erase me kneeling in the dirt." There was a flicker then, not shame but something more dangerous. Rage restrained by chains. "You were never mine," he spat. "Your mother was a mistake. A common whore with dreams too large for her station." "My mother loved me," Aurelia said, cutting in, her voice colder now. "That alone makes her more noble than you have ever been." He said nothing. But his eyes shifted. Away from hers. That was all the truth she needed. "I used to wonder," she said almost to herself, "what I would say to you. When I was older. When I had power. When I wasn't afraid anymore." She knelt not to meet his level but to mark the moment. Her fingers touched the mud. Not in reverence, in remembrance. "I thought it would feel like justice. Like victory." Her gaze held his, unwavering. "But it just feels finished." She stood. And turned. She left him there, bound, bitter, broken. Not to forgive. Not to condemn. But to walk away. Alive. Free. And that was enough. Across the camp, where snow clung to broken beams and frost crusted the shattered banners, the remnants of the war council had been reduced to silence. Inside what was left of the command tent, the king sat alone beside a dying fire. The crown was gone. The robe torn. Only the weight remained. He held a flask in one hand, the other resting on a table scorched black. His fine clothes were stained with sweat and soot. His gaze flickered with the firelight, unfocused, unseeing. When Haldric stepped through the tent flap, no guards stopped him. There were none left. Only truth now. The king looked up, bloodshot and hollow. "You came to gloat?" he rasped. Haldric said nothing at first. He stood like stone, the same way he had stood in battle, in court, in grief. "I came to end it," he said finally. The king gave a dry laugh. "Cracked like old wood. You were always sentimental." "No," Haldric said. "I was loyal." His voice sharpened. "Until you made loyalty a crime." He took one step closer. "I bled for this kingdom. I held the line when the beasts came from the north. I buried men in soil that will never forget their names. And still I stayed. Even when you lied. Even when you killed for pride." He exhaled, a sound like frost breaking. "But I will not serve a man who burns his own house to keep warm." The king's gaze dropped. Something inside him fractured. There were no words. Only silence. And in that silence the cost of every order, every betrayal, every life spent like coin, came crashing down. The fire hissed. Outside the morning grew pale. Campfires flickered in the hands of the survivors. Soldiers whispered in the language of the lost. No one reached for the crown. Not even the king. Haldric turned from the fire and stepped outside. Ash floated through the dawn like snow. He didn't look back. Behind him, the last flame of a broken reign died with a whisper. Chapter 16. Crown without a consort. The war was over. The banners had changed. The lion no longer roared from the palace spires. The court had scattered like ash on the wind, and the old names, the cruel, the gilded, the untouchable, had been buried beneath stone and silence. And Haldric, once the king's hound, once the duke of distant borders, once a soldier with too many ghosts, had become king. Not of opulence, not of legacy, but of ruin. Of what remained. There was no coronation feast. No golden throne. No queen beside him. No Arya. She had left the stronghold before the snow had sealed the passes. No fanfare. No escort. Just a worn satchel and boots caked in frost. She left no letter. Only silence. Some said she had gone to forget. Others claimed she was too proud, too stubborn, too wounded to stay. But Haldric said nothing. Let them talk. He did not send soldiers after her. He did not summon her by decree. But he sent things. Quietly. Carefully. In a quiet village hemmed in by pine and mist, she opened a small apothecary. People came to her not for who she had been, but for the way she listened. The way she knew where it hurt without asking. She brewed remedies for grief and salves for the wounded. She waited for the dreams to stop. They didn't. But they softened. Spring came slowly. And with it a rider. No livery. No guards. No crown. Just worn traveling clothes, dust on his boots, and a heart still carrying the shape of her name. She met him outside, arms folded, the sky pale behind her. Haldric. He pulled back his hood. His hair was longer now. A little gray at the temples. His face, older, tired, but steadier than it had ever been. You said you didn't want a crown, she said. I still don't, he answered. But I wear it because with it I can protect something. Someone. You. She studied him, eyes narrowed. And what do you want from me? He hesitated. Then, nothing. A beat. Everything. But only if you give it freely. Silence stretched between them. The kind that cracked open old wounds just enough to let light in. You don't get to erase what you did, she said. I'm not asking to. You hurt me. I know. You didn't protect me. His voice broke slightly. I see that now. She stepped forward, slowly, as if remembering how to breathe near him. I loved you, she whispered. He looked at her then, truly looked. Not as a king. Not as a warrior. Same here, I love you, he said. And I always will. Whether you return to the palace. You are not mine to claim. A long pause. Then her voice, soft and certain. Then start over. He blinked. What? Not as king, she said. Not as consort. As someone who once knew me. And might want to know me again. She reached for him, not with hesitation but with quiet grace. He took her hand. And this time she didn't flinch. The villagers watched from behind drawn curtains. They knew who he was. They had heard the stories. But he didn't bring soldiers and he didn't speak like a man above them. He held her hand like a man who had lost everything once and knew better than to demand it back. They walked together through the town, slowly, quietly, and when they reached the edge of the village where the trees bent low and wildflowers pushed through the thawing earth, he turned to her. You would be queen, he said. If you came back. I would be yours, she said. If I chose to. He waited. And then, after all the silence, all the ashes, all the pain, she nodded. Not out of duty, but love. That night, in the stillness before dawn, they sat on the apothecary steps, hand in hand, watching the sky shift from gray to gold. No crown. No throne. Just the beginning. The kingdom would wait. The court could rebuild. But for now, the king sat beside the only woman who had ever seen him. truly seen him and chose him still. She did not become queen because he asked her to. She became queen because she was. Years passed. The people still spoke of the war, how the king fell, how the rebellion rose. The tales were retold beside hearths, beneath stars, across inked pages and old stone walls. But what the realm remembered most was what came after. A quiet reign. A just one. And a queen who wore no jewels unless she picked them from the river herself. The palace gardens bloomed again. Not with lilies from distant ports or rare blooms fit for foreign crowns, but with the wild flowers Aurelia had loved since girlhood. It was there she spent her mornings, fingers dusted with soil, sleeves rolled high, hair unbound in the breeze. And it was there Haldric always found her. Not with guards. Not with titles. Just with that same soft look in his eyes, the one he'd worn the night she finally let herself believe he still loved her. It hadn't been a grand proposal. There were no crowds. No kneeling. No royal decree. Just a question, whispered into her shoulder as the firelight flickered and her laughter faded into the hush between them. "Would you be my queen, Aurelia?" he asked, voice low, steady. "Not for them. For me. For us." She had looked at him, truly looked, and saw the man who had once broken her heart and then spent every quiet moment since trying to mend it. And her answer was quiet, but clear. Yes. Their marriage was not remade. It was reborn. No pageantry. No court musicians. Only candlelight, her hand in his, and vows spoken like promises meant to be kept this time. That night when he touched her she didn't flinch. When she trembled he didn't rush. He kissed her not like a man claiming something, but like a man thanking the stars that she still wanted him at all. And when she cried, not from sorrow but from something deeper, something almost holy, he kissed every tear away, murmuring her name like a prayer. They did not fall into love. They chose it. Again and again. Scars and all. Their chambers were never far from the garden. Windows open. Sheets sun-warmed. 2 cups always waiting by the hearth. Some nights, Arya still woke from dreams that echoed with fire. But he was always there. His arm around her waist. His voice in her ear, low and real. "I'm here. I've got you." And she would turn toward him, press her lips to his chest and whisper, "I know." There was no need to run. No need to hide. Just this. A love that did not fade. Did not falter. Did not need the world's permission.